Wyoming Territory, June 1881. Dust rose behind the eastbound wagon like smoke from a dying fire, the kind that left behind nothing but ash and memory. Dawson Alder stood just off the trail, reins slack in his hand, watching the wagon carry her away. Natalie Rosewood, the girl he had loved since they were 16. Only now, she was wearing another man's ring, her veil tucked into the collar of a simple travel dress, her hair pinned like she always used to before Sunday church. She did not see him standing there, or if she did, she looked away. The man beside her, Augustus Crane, was older, wealthy from cattle and rail-tied land, and had the kind of power in town folk like Dawson never would. Not back then. Not as a ranch hand still wiping sweat from his brow and dirt from his boots just to make $1. Dawson did not follow. He just stood there, jaw locked, pain sitting heavy in his chest like a rock that refused to move. Then he turned his horse west and rode out of town that same day, disappearing into the wide, wild land that had always promised more than this place ever gave him. Natalie never heard from him again. 8 years passed. By the time Dawson rode back into Elk Hollow, the town looked smaller than he remembered. The saloon was still leaning like it had lost an argument with the wind. The church steeple had been repainted, but the bell sounded just the same, deep and solemn. He wore the years on his face, dust in the creases of his eyes, sun on his skin, and a quiet steadiness in his step. He had done good work, wrangled cattle in Arizona, fought fire in Montana, even helped build a telegraph line through Dakota Territory. But none of it filled that place in him that had hollowed out the day she left. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped in for some tobacco and a few nails. That was where he heard it. "She's back," the storekeeper muttered to another man near the bolts of calico. Natalie Crane, widow now, moved back with her little girl. Dawson froze, hand halfway to his coin pouch. Crane died last winter. Fever took him fast. Left her with next to nothing. House barely standing. Folks say she's living out near the ridge, in that old cabin her father built. He did not ask anything. Just paid and left, heart thudding hard in his chest. Later that evening, as the sun sank low and the wind began to cool, Dawson rode out toward the ridge. The cabin was there, all right, weathered and leaning, chimney cracked, the roof patched with old tin. Smoke curled from the flue, faint and struggling. A little girl, no more than 6, sat on the front step playing with a bundle of sticks. Her hair was dark like Natalie's, her eyes sharp and curious. When she looked up, Dawson saw it, Natalie's gaze, clear as day. "You are not from around here," she said plainly. "No, miss," Dawson said, dismounting slow. "Not anymore." She squinted at him. "You looking for my mama?" "I suppose I am." The door creaked open, and she stood there, older, thinner, but still her. Natalie. Her dress was plain, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands dusted with flour. She stared at him like she was not sure if he was real or just something she had dreamed up on a lonely night. "Dawson," she said, voice soft. "Natalie." Silence stretched between them, thick with what they never said and everything they had not forgotten. He looked at the girl. "She yours?" Natalie nodded. "Her name's Eliza." Eliza crossed her arms. "Mama, he is not scary. He is nice." Natalie gave a tired smile. "Go wash up, Eliza. Dinner's almost ready." When the girl disappeared inside, Natalie stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed over her chest. "You have not been here in 8 years. I know. You left without a word." "You married him," Dawson said, voice low but steady. "I could not stay." Natalie looked away, jaw tight. "I did what I thought was best." "I know," he said again. She sighed and leaned against the porch post, the wind playing with the loose strands of her hair. "He was not kind, Dawson. Not the way I thought he would be. I thought I was choosing safety. I did not know it would feel like prison. You do not have to tell me, he said gently. They stood there a while, the quiet settling between them like old dust. Do you need anything? He asked finally. Fixing? Supplies? She looked at him then, really looked. I need a roof that does not leak, a fence that will hold, and a winter pantry that is not empty. I can help, Dawson said. Natalie hesitated, then nodded once. All right. If you are offering work, I will not turn it down. I am not offering work, he said. I am offering help. Her eyes softened just a little. Over the next few weeks, Dawson showed up every morning and worked until the sun dipped behind the hills. He replaced the roof, mended the chimney, and dug a new garden bed where the soil was still good. Natalie never asked why he came back. He never asked why she stayed with a man who never deserved her. Eliza took to him fast, following him around like a pup, asking 1,000 questions he always answered with a quiet smile. He taught her how to hold a hammer, how to tie a rope, how to whistle with her fingers. One afternoon, while Eliza napped under the kitchen table with the dog, Natalie brought Dawson a cup of coffee. They sat on the porch steps, knees almost touching. You are good with her, Natalie said quietly. She is a smart one. She is half mine, Natalie said with a smile. Of course she is. Dawson chuckled. She has your stubborn. She does. They fell into silence, watching the sky shift colors. Then Natalie said, You could have written. I did, Dawson said. Never sent them. She looked at him, eyes wide. Why? I did not think it would change anything. Natalie blinked hard. It might have. He looked at her then, really looked. Do you regret it? She did not answer right away. Then, softly, every day, the wind moved through the trees, and something between them settled old pains softening, making room for something new. I do not regret coming back, he said. Natalie turned to him, her eyes shining. I am glad you did. And between them, something old began to bloom again, quiet but steady, like the first green shoot breaking through winter ground. By late July, the heat held close, heavy and still, and Dawson's shirt clung to his back by midday. He didn't mind. The fence line had needed rebuilding, and the work gave him something to hold on to: wood, wire, sweat. He'd always done best with his hands busy and his thoughts quiet. Natalie came out carrying a pail of water, her sleeves damp at the wrists, hair pinned up haphazardly. She set the bucket down near him and leaned against the post he'd just sunk. You're the only person I know who keeps working when the sun's trying to kill you. He tipped his hat back. If I stop moving, I'll start thinking. She didn't laugh. What's chasing you this time? He glanced toward the ridge, where cottonwoods stood like watchmen. Nothing new, just old things that never quite stopped following. I get that. She squatted beside the pail, dipping a cloth in and wringing it out. I dreamed last night I was still in his house. Couldn't find the door. Eliza was crying, but I couldn't reach her. He didn't look at her right away, just took the cloth and wiped his neck. Dreams lie. You found the door. I didn't walk through it, she said. It burned behind me. That hung between them, dry and brittle. Dawson folded the cloth and handed it back. You ever think about leaving this place altogether? She didn't answer right away. Sometimes. But I got roots here, even if they're cracked and shallow. Eliza's been asking about school. She's not of age yet. She's close. Natalie looked down at her hands, the knuckles dark from flour and ash. I know. I'm trying to find a way. Dawson nodded, then glanced toward the cabin. I could teach her letters. Numbers too. She raised a brow. You know your letters? Better than most. My ma taught school before she passed. He leaned against the post beside her, voice quieter now. She used to say if you can read the sky and the Bible, you'll never lose your way. Natalie smiled faintly. Your ma sounded like someone I'd have liked. She was a hard woman, but fair. They both watched the distant hills for a while, sagebrush waving low, a hawk turning high. There was a peace in the stillness, but it didn't erase the weight between them. You ever think about staying? She asked. Dawson's jaw twitched. I've thought about a lot of things. That wasn't what I asked. He looked at her then, rough hands resting against his thighs, eyes steady. Yes, I've thought about staying. Natalie stood and dusted her skirts. Good. That was all she said. But it was more than enough. Later that week, Dawson sat beside Eliza at the table, guiding her hand as she shaped the letter with a stub of charcoal on scrap paper. The girl's tongue stuck out in concentration. That one looks like a fence falling over, she said. Then you best fix it before the cows get through. Natalie watched from the doorway, arms folded. She listens to you. Dawson didn't take his eyes off Eliza's work. She reminds me of someone who used to do the same. Someone who stopped listening? Someone who was told not to. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The next morning, Natalie found a note on the table scrawled in Dawson's careful hand. Gone to town. Back by sundown. When he returned, his saddle bags were heavier. He carried a small slate, a bundle of chalk, and a worn reader's primer. He placed them on the table without a word. Natalie stared at the items. You didn't have to do that. I know. She touched the corner of the slate. You always did things quiet. I never saw much use in noise. That night, she poured 2 cups of coffee and joined him out near the barn. The moon was pale and distant, the air warm enough to leave the door open. You built a life, she said. Out there. Without me. He shook his head slowly. I tried, but it never held. She sipped from her cup, watching the way his fingers curled around the tin. I don't know what to do with you back. I'm not asking for anything. You should, she said. He looked over at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? I mean, if you want something, you should ask for it. He looked out toward the ridge again. You think there's still a place for me here? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, there's a man working my land, teaching my daughter, and fixing what I thought was beyond repair. If there's no place for you, then I've gone blind. Dawson didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at her with something deep and quiet in his expression. She stood and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind her. He followed. There were no declarations that night, no promises. Just a shared silence, unbroken by doubt, and the weight of something old turning slowly into something new. By mid-August, the wild asters bloomed in the low fields, and the nights grew quieter, cooler. The cabin no longer groaned with every wind that passed, and the garden had begun to take root in earnest. Dawson kept his bedroll in the barn, though it was clear he spent more time at the house than away from it. He still rode into town for supplies, but always returned by evening, often with a new book or some small thing Eliza could turn over in her hands and wonder at. One morning, Natalie stood in the doorway, apron still damp from rinsing clothes, watching Dawson harness the mule to the plow. She leaned her shoulder against the frame, arms crossed, brows drawn. You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't come here? He tightened the strap and didn't look up. Something with less meaning. That's a tidy answer. It's a true one. She stepped down onto the packed dirt, bare feet dark with dust. I used to picture you in Arizona. I'd imagine you sleeping under stars so far from here they couldn't possibly be the same ones. He turned then, slow, the mule shifting beside him with a low grunt. I spent enough nights like that. They didn't feel much like stars after a while, just cold light. Natalie knelt beside the trough and dipped a gourd into the water. I told myself I didn't miss you. You believed it? For a time. Then Eliza started asking why I looked sad when the wind changed. He took the plow handles in both hands and waited until she looked up. And what did you tell her? That I was remembering somebody who didn't know how to leave things halfway. Dawson squinted into the sun. I never meant to leave you with a wound. You didn't. I made my own choices. The mule brayed, restless, and Dawson ran a hand down its neck before setting it into motion. Natalie stood beside the furrow, watching the soil turn. That evening, after Eliza was asleep with her book still open on her chest, Dawson sat at the table fixing a leather strap. Natalie stitched a hem by lamplight, her fingers moving smooth and practiced. The silence between them was warm, not wary. I got a letter today, she said. Not looking up, Dawson glanced at her hands. From who? Town council. They're looking for someone to tend the schoolhouse again come September. You thinking about it? I gave up teaching when I married. Wasn't allowed to keep the post. You still have the mind for it. Mine's not the trouble. It's the walking back into a room where everyone saw me as a man's property for 6 years. He set the strap aside. You'd be walking in as yourself. Natalie threaded her needle through the final edge and tied it off. Would you stay if I did? His answer came without pause. Yes. She folded the fabric and set it aside. Eliza's going to need a steady hand. Not just in the house. In her life. She's got one. You. She needs two. Dawson leaned forward. Is that you asking? Natalie met his gaze steady. I'm not asking out of loneliness, or because things got hard. I'm asking because I don't want to keep wondering what we lost. He didn't speak. He just reached across the table and took her hand. Rough against rough, years of labor written into every callus. She didn't pull away. Outside, the crickets started up, and the wind shifted through the cottonwoods. I don't wear the ring, she said quietly. Haven't in over a year. You don't have to explain. I'm not explaining. I'm telling you I'm free to choose. Dawson turned her hand over in his palm, thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. Then choose me. I already am. He nodded once, and the silence that followed said more than any vow. It was not rushed or loud, not the kind of love that demanded to be heard. It was the kind that had waited, endured, and finally quietly begun to bloom again. That night, he did not return to the barn. When the lamp was turned low and the coals in the stove just faintly red, they lay side by side in the narrow bed, her head tucked beneath his chin, his arm resting over her waist. No words were exchanged. There was no need. In the stillness, they breathed the same air, the same hard-earned peace, and let the past rest behind them like a storm finally passed. September brought wind that tugged dry leaves across the yard and turned mornings sharp with chill. On the first Monday of the month, Natalie stood at the schoolhouse door in a brown wool dress, her hair braided down her back, a slate and chalk balanced beneath her arm. Eliza clung to her skirt, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her small satchel swinging against her side. Dawson held the reins of the wagon he'd borrowed from the Bensons. You sure? Natalie nodded once. They voted unanimous. Mrs. Wendell's rheumatism kept her from returning, and no one else stepped forward. He helped Eliza up onto the seat. They'll be lucky to have you. Natalie, adjusting her collar, glanced at him. I'm not doing this for them. He didn't answer, only offered his hand as she climbed up beside her daughter. The wind lifted a lock of her hair, and he tucked it behind her ear without a word. That afternoon, Dawson stopped by the blacksmith's. He traded 2 cured hides for a second-hand stove, smaller than the one in the house but enough to heat the barn through the winter. You're settling in, then? The the smith said, eyeing him. Found what I needed, Dawson replied, tying the stove down. Didn't know I was looking for it. Back at the homestead, he unloaded the stove and started laying stone for a hearth in the barn's back corner. By dusk, he'd blackened his hands and torn a hole in his shirt, but the stove stood level. He set one of Eliza's leftover biscuits on top, warming it for her return. The school bell rang clear across the plain. By the time the wagon rolled up, the sun had dipped behind the hills, and the air smelled of dry hay and wood smoke. Eliza was asleep against her mother's side. Natalie stepped down and lifted her daughter into Dawson's arms without speaking. He carried the child inside and laid her on the bed, pulling the quilt to her chin. Natalie's voice came from behind him, low and tired. She asked today if you'd stay for supper. He turned. I planned to. Out at the table, she ladled stew from the pot into 2 bowls and poured water from the crock. She told one of the other children her pa lives in the barn. She say it like she's ashamed? No, Natalie said. She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. He took a seat, eyes on her hands as she passed him a bowl. She's got her own way of seeing things. She's watching us, Natalie said, sitting across from him. Not just you and her. Me too. The way I speak when I'm tired. The way you look at me when I'm not watching. She notices. Dawson spooned stew into his mouth, then set the bowl down. Then let's give her something worth carrying. Natalie looked up from her bread. And what would that be? A home that holds, he said. Even when the wind comes hard. Later that night, they stepped out onto the porch, the lantern inside throwing amber light through the window. Natalie leaned against the post, arms wrapped around herself. She asked if we were going to get married. He shifted beside her. You tell her. I said I didn't know. That grown folks move slower than children. He nodded. She wrong to ask? No, Natalie said. She's just ahead of us. They stood quiet, the stars blinking out one by one as the clouds rolled in. The scent of rain on dust rose around them. I don't need a preacher to know what I want, Dawson said after a while. But if it matters to you, I'll ride into Douglas tomorrow and find one. Natalie turned to him, her face open, unguarded. It matters to me, but not because of town talk. He waited. I want to stand beside you and not wonder if the ground's going to shift. I want Eliza to know what it looks like when love is chosen and kept. Dawson reached for her hand, his fingers coarse, hers chilled from the night air. Then let's choose it. She nodded once, eyes shining but steady. We already have. Inside, Eliza stirred and whispered something in her sleep. Natalie turned toward the sound, and Dawson followed her in, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The lamp still glowed on the table. The stove crackled low, and outside, the wind passed them by without stopping. The wedding was held in the pasture behind the house, where the land dipped gently between 2 cottonwoods. It was early October, the trees half bare, their leaves scattered like copper coins over the grass. Natalie wore a dress she'd sewn herself with fabric Dawson had brought back from town, a deep blue calico with tiny white blossoms she said reminded her of spring. Dawson stood beside her in a clean shirt and his best trousers, the knees still faintly faded from years of wear. Eliza carried a bunch of dried wildflowers she tied with twine. She walked ahead of her mother with a seriousness that made the handful of neighbors smile. Reverend Markham stood between the trees, Bible in hand, his voice low and steady as he spoke over the wind. No one cried, though a few folk cleared their throats. Natalie kept her eyes on Dawson, and Dawson never looked away from her. When the vows were spoken and the Reverend nodded, Dawson took her hands and pressed his forehead gently to hers before kissing her, slow and sure. The gathered folk clapped. A few gave whoops, and Eliza grinned so wide her cheeks turned pink. Afterward, they shared bread, apples, and a roast Dawson had butchered himself. Someone brought a fiddle, and though Natalie didn't dance, she stood beside Dawson while Eliza spun in circles in the grass, her laughter rising as light as the breeze. The guests left before nightfall. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of hearth smoke and dry wheat. Dawson carried Eliza, already drowsing, up to the loft and tucked her under the quilt. Natalie stood by the doorway, arms folded, watching him. "She asked yesterday if she could call you Papa," she said when they stepped back into the kitchen. "What did you tell her?" "I said she could ask you herself." Dawson glanced toward the loft. "I'd be proud if she did." Natalie reached for his hand. "You've earned her trust. I just kept showing up." She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. "That's more than most ever do." They stood like that a long while, the fire in the stove casting shadows along the floorboards. There was no need to speak. The silence was full. Over the next weeks, the rhythm of their life took shape without effort. Natalie rose early, packed a small basket for the schoolhouse, and left with Eliza as the sky brightened. Dawson worked the land, repairing the last stretch of fence before the ground froze, cutting wood, and laying feed for the wintering animals. At night, with the lantern lit low, he read aloud to Eliza from the primer until her eyes closed. Then he joined Natalie on the porch or by the fire, where they sat with their knees touching and no need to fill the quiet. One evening, late in November, Natalie set down her mending and said, "I never thought I'd feel safe again." Dawson looked up from the carving he was shaping for Eliza's Christmas. "Do you?" She nodded. "With you, I do." He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. "I'll never stop showing up, Nat. Not ever." She touched his face, her thumb brushing the line of his jaw. "I know." They spent their first Christmas together with snow up to the porch rail and the cabin warm from the stove. Eliza woke to find a carved horse and a set of wool mittens Dawson had traded for in town. Natalie made cinnamon bread, and they ate it slowly, the three of them pressed close at the table. That spring, the garden bloomed strong. Eliza began reading full sentences on her own, her brow furrowed in concentration, her voice proud. Natalie returned to the schoolhouse, not as a woman trying to prove herself, but as one who already had. Dawson built a smokehouse behind the barn and added a second stall for the mule's foal. Born late one night with Eliza watching wide-eyed from the hayloft. They never left Elk Hollow. There was no need. The cabin held warmth now, not just from the stove but from the way Natalie's laughter filled the corners, and the way Dawson's boots landed heavy but sure on the floor each evening. Eliza grew taller, her questions sharper, and her hand in Dawson's as steady as any blood daughter's. Years passed. The seasons turned. The land kept them honest and the work kept them close. And every night, as the lamps dimmed and the wind brushed against the eaves, Dawson would kiss Natalie's shoulder and whisper, "Still choosing you." She'd smile, eyes closed, and say, "Always." They grew old that way together, not in silence, but in peace, not in longing, but in love.